Ladies and gentlemen, it's absolutely fantastic to be able to welcome you all back to another cloud debate hosted here at the University of Johannesburg. Of course, we're all sitting in the comfort of our homes tonight, as we should, because we are doing this as an online event and as a webinar, as per usual, I should say. Tonight, we have an exciting topic, and we are talking about evolution as revolution. So many people are still unsure about what the fourth industrial revolution actually means and how it works. And of course, at UJ, we've been debating this for a long time, and we have understood that the fourth industrial revolution, as a fact of life in the 21st century, is a watershed moment. It is a revolution in our societal evolution. And now we are also experiencing and living through a pandemic. As tech analyst Arthur Goldstock has stated, the coronavirus is an unavoidable case study of the fourth industrial revolution in action. And this episode of our cloud debate is going to explore how the pandemic has isolated us all virtually, but also brought us together in many ways in order to stay safe. In short, we are discussing how the COVID-19 epidemic in the time of the fourth industrial revolution is changing our lives, and it's becoming a revolution within an evolution. And with me tonight, I have a fantastic panel of specialists to try to discern what this means and what the pandemic means and how it also helps shape the fourth industrial revolution and vice versa. Firstly, I have Akram Mohammed, who is the Chief Technology Officer of Huawei Consumer Business Group in South Africa. A warm welcome to you, Akram, and I'm so happy that you could join us online for this panel tonight, and I'm so looking forward to discussing tonight's topic with you. So, warm welcome.
Thank you very much.
Also tonight, we have Peter du Toit, who is from the Future Work IQ, which specializes in helping businesses prepare for the future and actually to future-proof businesses and the future world of work. So a warm welcome to you, Peter. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you.
And last but not least, a colleague of mine here at UJ, Professor Terence van Zyl, who holds the Nedbank Research Chair in our Institute for Intelligence Systems at UJ. A warm welcome to you, Terence, and it's great that you could join us tonight.
Evening.
Thank you. So, without much further ado, I think that the overarching question that we are trying to discuss tonight and we're trying to get to grips with is in what way, and in the times of the COVID-19 pandemic, how has this escalated the adoption and the usage of 4IR technologies? So basically, what is it that, how has the pandemic influenced and the technologies that we connect them with the fourth industrial revolution? As I introduced you first, Akram, and you're from a technology intense company, what is your take on it?
I kind of felt that was coming since I was introduced first. Thank you for that. I think, great question, Ilva, and looking at what's been happening specifically around telecommunications over the last few years. I think it's taken us around a decade, specifically if we're talking about 5G and spectrum allocation. That'll come to top of mind firstly. It's taken so long for ICASA and the regulators to be able to issue the additional spectrum. But what we have found is during COVID and the restrictions we've had, this has given us a wake-up call, and it's allowed government to now go and allocate emergency spectrum as one example, which will probably, it's lasting until November, but we are optimistic that it'll be extended even beyond. The point of the matter is that something that has been put on the back burner for quite some time and perhaps wasn't given as much importance. And we know how valid or how vital it is for technologies has now come to the fore, and we're starting to see some kind of movement. And the reason that we've started to see this kind of change is because I think when people are locked down, we have working from home, we have homeschooling, you're looking at streaming services going off the charts, similar kind of growth has been happening in terms of e-commerce penetration and adoption, the networks just didn't have capacity and they couldn't be able to offer the quality of service that they required. So it became imperative that this kind of emergency spectrum is then allocated. So we are starting to see those kind of changes. Also, what is quite interesting is about 2 months ago, I was part of a CIO roundtable with IT Rep, and we had over 25 leaders from financial services to investment houses. We've even had top retailers and even energy generators. We were all part of this discussion to say, how are we going to move forward when it comes to digital transformation? And what does that really mean? Were we ready? Did we have the right tools or capabilities and abilities? And this discussion really showed us that COVID-19 has actually pushed us, say, 4 to 5 years forward compared to where we thought we were. And you are seeing this happen in many, many spaces. One of that being e-commerce, as an example, which represents around just over 1% of South African retail sales. However, in the last quarter, you got the likes of OneCart, Take-A-Lot, that's posting growth over 400%, over a quarter. You looked at Huawei as one example over the last 3 months, and this is, something that's been sustained month on month. We've just posted 805% increase in our own personal e-commerce platform, something that's absolutely unheard of. So we can see these kind of adoption, the change in mentality or perception. South Africans were a bit resistant, perhaps due to concerns around service, concerns around security, but maybe to use online purchasing. But now that we are forced into this area, we're seeing that the adoption will definitely drive innovation and perhaps further implementation of these kind of 4-hour technologies going forward.
It's fascinating. Peter, 4 to 5 years, Akram says, it's pushed us that far. Do you agree?
I absolutely agree with that. I think that this incident has basically acted as an accelerant for digital transformation. There's no question about that. So, the virus basically attacks humans, but it's also attacked our systems. And, a lot of if you take government, for example, their infrastructure and technology is old and fragile and not well suited for having to analyze data in real time. But we've seen some, as Akram mentioned, some massive strides happen regarding this. I mean, if you think in the South African context, the WhatsApp service that the health department started using, the World Health Organization as an entity adopted that, and the South African business that created that application, that use of WhatsApp, now the World Health Organization is using it to get messaging out. But we've seen, in places like Singapore, them using WhatsApp and Telegram to get out messages to people in 4 languages. In Korea, they've actually launched an app called Corona 100M, which is an app that if you give it permission, it will tell you if there's been a coronavirus case within 100 meters of you. So those kinds of technologies are now being adopted at speed. In the Western Cape, where I am, we've got the Western Cape dashboard where they show what currently is happening with the pandemic. Every day you can see, your area right down to suburb level where the infections are. Now, what that does is it gives people so much more power to make wise decisions, for businesses to know what they need to do. So I agree with Akram 100%. This incident has just taken what was happening at a slow pace and has just acted as an accelerant to make this now what we're experiencing at the moment, for sure.
Yeah, well, thank you for that, Peter. I think, Terence, would you agree with what has been said here by your colleagues on the panel, and also maybe thinking ahead a little bit? Are there differences here, whether you're in South Africa or somewhere else in the world, maybe? Do we see a global north, global south divide in this pushing ahead as well, maybe?
So, yeah, I think I can kind of summarize what they're saying in a way. We find that most technology comes with a very steep learning curve, and that a lot of the time people are quite resistant to technologies just because of trust or fear, these kind of things. And so many of these, I often think of technology as this wall, and on the other side of the wall, there's higher productivity. There's almost a better space for us, but we have to climb over the wall. And so because of that, most people resist going over. And I think what's interesting right now with many things like moving to online meetings or moving to e-commerce, we've been forced over the wall. A lot of people have been forced into that uncomfortable space, had to do the learning, have had to take on the learning curve of using Zoom or Google Meet or whatever it might be. And now we're on that side, and it's quite comfortable. It's quite a comfortable space for us.
Yeah.
To your second part over there, in terms of the divide, I think that is probably the greatest risk that we face right now. And maybe it's not a north-south thing, but more a sense that we've put ourselves in a position of those who have and have not technology. And we're probably going to have to deal with that at some point, because some of us have been pushed into the space where we have the ability to acquire these skills, but some people might not be able to acquire the skills or be able to use these technologies, move into this new workforce that requires you to be able to attend meetings online. And we're going to have to think about that a little bit more broadly as a society. How do we move forward from there?
Now, interesting. I want to touch upon two things that I think that has come up. And one is the more specific technologies that we see coming out of maybe that the pandemic has either sort of innovative, creative, or maybe pushed to the fore. But then also the business model of businesses in South Africa. And maybe, Peter, coming back to you, there's a question from the audience that says, do you think this will change service delivery models in South Africa? Someone is mentioning post office services, for example. Have they, are these kind of small businesses changing their models, how they operate, which then influence bigger structures in society, maybe?
Well, the answer to that would be definitely. I imagine, because we are going to be dealing with this situation for a protracted period, there's so much change that is beginning to happen. And, for example, there's a whole lot of businesses at the moment which are doing particularly well. So it's companies that have got cloud-based functions which allow their teams to be able to work from anywhere. It's organizations that have a seamless online presence that makes it very easy to help consumers with issues that they're dealing with. In our local municipality, to give you an example, car registration discs. What you had to do, if you had to pay for your car's registration, you had to actually go to the counter and, you pay them cash and you made the transaction and they gave you the new disc. And now what they've done is they've had to innovate, even in that department. And now you can email, you get documents that you have to fill in, you can email it back, and then you can arrange a collection, which happens very quickly because the amount of time that you then spend at the counter has been reduced dramatically. So those kind of things, efficient ways to distribute products to consumers with limited contact, products that make business more digitally efficient. All those things are now beginning to come to the fore as a result of the changes that we need to make with the way that we do business in general.
And Akram, maybe that's something that I imagine that you do at Huawei, that there's that thinking of how you structure now the backbone of these kind of service delivery models and so on, and also bringing it to the consumer, I imagine.
Most certainly, and I got to agree completely with what Peter said, but also make reference to Terence earlier on when he mentioned about the resistance of certain consumers with regards to adopting new technologies. And we find that a lot of the reason for resistance is because when we talk about 4IR tech, they are spoken about in isolation. Just 5G or just artificial intelligence or just AI. And we have a huge problem here because then we can't be able to create real use cases. It's all marketing hype most of the time. We live in such an unequal society in South Africa. We want to talk about self-driving vehicles potentially coming down the line when our people, a lot of them don't have access to clean water and sanitation. Then you ask yourself, is this really the place you should be putting your investment? But when you combine these technologies together and you say, well, big data, cloud computing, artificial intelligence, and 5G, and the potential to improve lives and society, then you are able to say, well, we've got something we can really work with here to improve the country. And, you know, it goes back to what Peter was talking about just now on those kind of companies that really made it over this period. They were doing precisely just that. If you take the online retail model and you compare it to traditional retail, the likes of Massmart and their store chains, whether it's Game or Macro, they really pushed quite a bit into online over the last few years, and they were preparing themselves. One thing they didn't get right was their distribution channel and their logistics network. Takealot had that checked. Takealot also had the big data to back them up, to understand consumer need and you know, be able to adapt that. And that is why, because if I go and make, and I'm saying, well, I want to try out online retail, and I was resistant before. Waiting a week is definitely not going to make me come back to be able to get my item if it is a poor experience for the very first time. So we need to be able to get that consumer experience sorted out as well. And I think it goes back to the question that was posed, will the postal services ever reach that level? I think it is, again, if we are able to sit down and fix the entire process and the value chain to say, how do we get there using these various technologies? Perhaps we can. But if we're just going to go out on a limb and say, well, 5G is the next great thing, or it's just big data and work only in one area, we're probably not going to get there. And if I may just add one more thing, it comes to a very similar scenario that we're experiencing now under COVID. You know, we know government invested a whole lot of money in terms of health services, in terms of PPE, trying to get more beds available for those that are unwell. And one of the situations we've seen is with the field hospitals, whether it's in the Eastern Cape or Gauteng, that were created. Now, the thinking and the intention was very noble. And I think everybody said, well, we need this so we have enough beds, sufficient beds to take care of the people. What we did not think about is who's going to man those beds. So right now we have 30% or so occupation. It's not because you know, we didn't do the right things. It's because we don't have enough doctors or nurses, healthcare workers to be able to facilitate and take care of that. We don't have enough ventilators or PPE as an example. But when you take 4IR and you have a technology like 5G combined with artificial intelligence, you can be able to do remote consultations. You know, you can be able to do those kind of remote interventions, similar to what Vodacom and Discovery announced recently, where you are able to have that consultation with your doctor online to at least do a screening before going into a medical facility and putting other people at risk. That's when we see the real world use cases. And I think it's very important for us to collaborate across the board and bring these things together.
It's interesting you say that, Akram, because those are the questions that actually comes up online here from the audience as well. Are there the differences here between, of course, the commercial platforms, commercial retailers, for example, and the commercial sector, maybe more generally, vis-a-vis then a state sector or government sector? And I'm going to turn to you, Terence, in terms of these differences then, and there are a lot of questions coming from the audience saying, but is our government innovative enough in this space? And do we then have, and I think that there are certain things that Akram picks up on here as well. So for example, when it comes to healthcare, it's a healthcare system, and particularly then our public health system, ready for this and these changes and these disruptive changes?
I think it's an interesting in a sense. I mean, if you think about the way we're dealing with this entire pandemic, we've almost entrusted the decision-making process of our government to models. We've moved into a space where we use machine learning models, AI models, statistical models to tell us how we're supposed to make decisions as a country. The government is doing this. They're looking at these models that are predicting how this thing is going to spread, and they're trying to use all of this information on the one side. On the other side, they're having to deal with the reality of the living conditions of people, resistance by individuals, you know, in terms of will they actually adopt the policies that they try and put in place, the interventions, these kind of things. You know, there's this balance of, you know, you have these really sophisticated models. They tell you shut down this or do this or stop selling that, and no one listens. Now what do? How do you bring that back into the model? How do you close these sort of loops? So I think on one level, government is using AI and machine learning and modeling. In other places, I think they probably have tried for a long time. I know organizations like the CSIR have tried for a long time to try and bring technology into the space because they see it as a way of sort of democratizing the delivery of service. If you can get the technology into these environments. But it's been very frustrating, and it's very difficult to try and put the technology down there. It's not often accepted. It doesn't have the kind of impact that you would expect. So I think, I don't think that our government is necessarily not trying. I don't think that they aren't aware of these things or that they don't invest in it. I think that South Africa is very unique in the way that this type of technology is absorbed into the greater community, and I don't think it's something you can just force down people's throats. And I think it's going to be a sort of something that will evolve in its own way, how this sort of infrastructure moves around. I mean, some technologies were far advanced in South Africa. For instance, mobile operators are far advanced compared to some developed countries where they still might be using landlines. But then other aspects are a lot less advanced. So, you know, some places we leapfrog, other places we see that it's a lot more difficult to try and push technologies onto people. And I think it's not a failing of our government per se. I think this is just something that's unique to our situation.
Yeah, that's interesting. And have we seen any, I'm going to turn to you, Peter, have we seen any particular technologies that has been assistive in this space or that have been put to the fore maybe because of the pandemic?
So my answer to that would be yes. And I just want, you know, for everybody that's watching this to realize that the way healthcare is delivered around the world, not just in South Africa, globally, hasn't really changed for about 100 years, you know, since the Spanish flu, really. And so what's now suddenly come to the fore is the need to do consultations differently. So in my way of thinking, if I think of you know, the doctors that I'm connected to and the way that they're working, I would say that telehealth is going to be something that is now going to be looked at to get given the official green light that you can actually consult with your doctor via a video call, for example. So that has been something that's happened. The other thing that has also come to the fore, especially if you are having to assist people remotely. And if you think about what this is going to mean for remote communities as well, and as Akram says, if we've got 5G, then what we're going to have is remote medicine is going to become a real reality. But right now, you know, the technologies that people actually can have access to, I mean, you can buy an oxygenated little thing from Dischem for 100 and whatever rand that can check your oxygen levels, which is very valuable for a physician who's not at home or you not at a hospital. They can actually tell you, listen, if it gets down to this percentage, you must get to the emergency room, which those kind of things are beginning to happen already. So in my thinking is we are going to see telehealth become a reality, especially in our area. That's my view.
And would you agree with that, Akram? Because you sit on the sort of, you know, developing technologies and services for the consumer market. Do you see the same thing happening, Akram?
Yeah, certainly. We see that happening, and in the other territories that we operate in as well. A lot of times it's been adopted in the likes of Europe, in Asia. Remote surgeries have already become a thing. But I think diagnosis is the most important way that we can be able to implement it right now. Because when it comes to consultations, diagnosis takes the most amount of time and resources rather than the actual treatment of that ailment. So again, like I said, if you combine technologies like artificial intelligence and 5G, of course, no latency for 5G, the remote connectivity, but then the AI supporting to help with the diagnosis, it provides more time and frees up time to actually treat the issue. That's one area. And I think the other very important thing is, again, going back to what Peter and both what Terence says, I agree with Terence. Our government is doing a hell of a lot and they are trying, and the intentions are great, and they want to be able to improve. But it's quite fragmented between what government is doing and then the private sector and then society itself. And that's where I tend to find that there's a bit of an issue. It's because, like I said, we're so unequal in society, and you can see what is happening now with COVID. We knew a long time ago, the income inequalities and the gaps in society. But now with COVID and people under lockdown, we're trying to save lives, but then we also got to worry about feeding people because we have so many out there that don't even have food. And that impacts social grants and resources. And we don't have money or funding for other areas. So I think for any of these technologies, I completely agree. Telemedicine is going to be the next thing. And it's possible we can be able to do it right now. But before we do that, because we don't want it to be reserved for a few like us who's fortunate enough to have this call because we've got great internet access, we need to be able to create access to technology for everybody. And before we create that, the main way to create access is through connectivity. So the network operators and government needs to ensure that we have coverage in most areas throughout South Africa. And I don't care whether that coverage is 5G, even if it's 4G LTE or at least 3G. But get people connected, because access to connectivity and the internet, we know, can remove people from poverty completely. It can change societies. So once we have that, then we can talk about rolling out 5G. And I think that is the foundation. And that's why it's getting so much attention right now, is because we can't talk about everything else if we don't have that low latency, high connectivity speeds of 5G. So right now, this morning I had a call with George Mendes at Vodacom, Chief Officer, and we had a discussion, an actual interview on how we plan to roll this out. And he also agreed that this is the way we need to be able to address this, is to say, fiber or fixed broadband right now, we know how great it is and it has all its benefits, but it comes at a huge cost. It cannot be rolled out anywhere. You need to lay cables. We've got internet service providers. The barrier to entry is quite high. But 5G being a mobile first technology, we can be able to speed that up. And that will naturally be able to bring down cost. And of course, once cost comes down, you reach scale, and then it's available to more people. Once we have that foundation sorted, then we can be able to say, well, what else can we do in part of the 4IR conversation and agenda? So this is, I think it's the first step. And the fact, again, it goes back to spectrum and what government is doing to make that possible. So we're heading in the right direction, but we need to have more conversations like this. And then all entities, private and public, to work together to make it happen.
Mm. No, thank you for that. And I'm going to turn to Terence here, because there's actually a question about exactly this that's coming from the audience as well. So access, we've spoken about access many times during these cloud debates, because of course that is the context which is the real and lived reality and experience of most South Africans, that they don't have access. And Terence, can we facilitate this? And we've spoken a little bit about this, the forging of ties between the private and public sectors, of course. But as someone says online here, so connectivity is one thing, but how do we make sure that the connectivity is affordable for a country with near 30% unemployment and a worsening situation because of COVID? I don't know if there's any thoughts on that from the panelists, but maybe I'll turn to you first, Terence.
Yeah, I think, I guess in this fourth industrial revolution space, it's definitely one of the underpinning technologies for us is connectivity. I don't think anyone can participate in this new normal, if that's what it's going to be called, without having a mechanism to go online and to be able to talk to people online, to participate online. I think every single part that we're seeing, the sort of big benefits, massive online education, or the democratization of these type of things, are all enabled by this connectivity. It's such a tough question, because these types of questions are probably best aimed at socialists and politicians rather than someone with a background in technology. But what I have seen or believe is that in certain parts of the world, you take a place like South Korea, they've started to consider something like connectivity to be at the same level as electricity and water. So that shift towards a thinking in which It's not, you know, it's a basic human right to have connectivity. And there should be some minimum amount of it that everyone has access to. And obviously to achieve that is a very, very difficult thing, because nothing is truly free. Someone has to pay for that connectivity at some level, whether it's through taxpayers' money or some sort of private public partnership or whatever it might be. But what we have seen is that where there's been a will to do so, whether it's been in the space of news or in the space of really bringing down the cost of music, so sort of online streaming for Netflix or whatever it might be, you can really get the prices of these things really, really low, and even bring them, you know, make them free if you start thinking smartly about how do you bring marketing, advertising in, how do you shift that cost to some other place. And I think that's probably where the smart solutions are going to have to come from, together with some sort of support from government, obviously, to say, okay, we also use the taxpayers' money to provide people with connectivity in the same way as people are provided with education, healthcare, lights, water, you know, these type of things. But I mean, I'm not the one to give the answer for that. I think others might have had some insights there.
No, those are, of course, you know, the policy decisions that are needed and so forth. And I think that, I mean, it's interesting. There's a question as well that we that disregarded that came up online as well, and that is about it's Pravia Patel, who says, you know, we all talk about the pandemic as being this massive disruptor, and it has changed in business models and service delivery models. And the question, of course, is are there downsides to this disruption? And I think also building on Pravia's question here is that I would like to add, who are the losers in this game? Are these service delivery models, are they apt to capture the people then that you are talking about now, Terence, that aren't, you know, don't have connectivity or don't have access, as Akram talked about earlier as well? I don't know, Peter, if you have any thoughts on that.
So just to carry on with Terence's comment, and maybe Akram can fill in with this, we have one of the highest mobile penetrations in the world, I think. So it's not that devices aren't in the hands of people. That's not the issue. But the same other research says that our data is one of the most expensive in the world. So there's a disconnect between what we could possibly do with this mobile penetration that we have, and you know, bringing data costs down so that they can be seriously affordable. But to Pravir's comment, obviously there are going to be losers in this situation. You know, there are going to be businesses, for example, that are just not going to come back from this. That is the truth of this situation, and we've just got to accept that with any disruption of this nature, and it is a serious global disruption, we are going to see people that lose. So from that perspective, for those individuals, I assume that, you know, you could say that is a downside for sure. But what history has proven to us is that many people that face a situation like that end up becoming innovators, almost by force of the situation that they find themselves in. So while I see certain industries losing and certain things not coming back, at the same time, I see a lot of energy from people who have been disrupted actually becoming innovators in fields and pushing forward the new world that we are now heading into in ways that we can't even imagine right now.
It's interesting. And Akram, you probably see some of these innovations. What would they be?
Yeah, I think we're already starting to see, you know, an interesting quote comes to mind from Winston Churchill when he says, never waste a good crisis. And and we've seen this take place previously as well. I mean, if you look at the recession back in 08, 09, and how that completely decimated markets and retail, specifically internationally. But also at the same time, you saw the rise of the likes of Amazon and these giants that come up. And transform because they were able to adapt and they were able to move with those times. So I think these are some of the innovations that you're going to see coming in where, none of us on this panel are soothsayers. And like Terence said, we're not even politicians. So we can't predict the future. But what we can do is we can look at history and what history has taught us. We can look at the technologies that are available, and we can look at the data that's there now. And we can be able to, make an educated guess, if you may say, or an assumption of this is where it should go. But I think we definitely in a time that if we take in all the positives that's around it and we work together, like I said earlier on, you're going to see huge improvements. But again, it comes back to policy decisions, which we are unable to influence perhaps, and those kind of things, And when I say policy decisions, I know one of your questions asked about pricing in relation to the unemployment rate. We know how bad the unemployment rate is, and we know that it's even prior to COVID, it was really bad for South Africans. And right now, it's just gotten even worse. But what do we do about that? I think as human beings in our nature, we tend to solve a problem for now and not try to solve for tomorrow's problems. And that's what we should be doing. If you look at other countries like the UK, for example, I think looking at the gig economy specifically, around just over 15%. Of their population is in the gig economy, or the working population, should I say. And in the United States, it should be around 43% at the end of this year. So those are things as South Africa we can perhaps influence to say, yes, we have an unemployment problem and we need to bring pricing down. But how do we also use technology to enable our unemployed to at least earn an income, and a decent income at that? Do we have processes in place? Do we have sufficient platforms? I mean, internationally, they are using the likes of Upwork and Fiverr, and all of these things are doing extremely well. Do we have programs here that will enable these kind of startups and businesses to take effect now? If you look at what's happening in our context, many individuals who have lost their jobs are sitting at home, and it's really bad. I know just in my circle alone, I know numerous people that are unemployed, but many of them are highly skilled. They could perhaps offer their services remotely. But is there a platform that enables that? Is there policy that enables that? And those are some of the discussions we need to be having to say, encourage South Africa to grow in that direction, then only we'll see improvement. We need to start at the bottom and solve, I think, social problems first, and then we can use technology to develop everything else and move forward. And that's the only time we'll be able to succeed, unfortunately.
I hear you, and I think it's interesting. You quoted Churchill, "Never waste a good crisis," but it might also be so that this is a crisis that also pushes or maybe widens the gap between the haves and the have-nots, and I think that's what we're fearful of right now. And Terence, would you say that we have the systems and structures in place to not to waste the crisis and actually to narrow the gap rather than having it widen in South Africa today? Are the systems and structures there?
I'm hesitant to say that we will come out of this with that gap narrower. It's really something I think is the downside of this situation. If I were to, just thinking about that concept of how will this COVID-19 impact us negatively, I think when you adopt technologies sort of on your own time and you have the means to sort of decide how you will bring this in, what kind of policies you will put in place, you can take things slowly. When you're forced into a corner like this, we kind of rush into it and we have to start doing things, and there's a real risk that we sort of give up our privacy in a way that we needn't. The sort of right to be forgotten, everything's happening online, everything's recorded, every meeting, you're not chatting with someone next to the water cooler anymore. And really, I think sort of this, a certain portion of South Africa already was disadvantaged in the sense that they never had the access to the technology in the first place. And now we've sort of creating an environment, a working environment where you sort of benefit most if you can exploit that technology. And so those people that aren't able to exploit that, what do we do? I mean, right now we're giving them a grant of 350 Rand.
Yes, yes. And that you often then, and this is a bone of contention, is that often you need access to certain technologies to access desk because you can't go to the post office or normal points as well. So that, you know, there are issues there as well. Maybe staying with you, Terence, before I go to our other colleagues on the panels, but what do you think are the technological fields and of technological fields of research maybe that we should invest in, and sort of what financial resources versus human capital resource do we need to do so?
I did spend a bit of time thinking about this question of, what are the type of research that we really need to put our minds to. I think one of the ones that I think is going to really benefit us right now is trying to understand how we merge our current working physical space, so the shared space we have right now, sort of what each of us is sitting in our own office, but it's also, at home. How do we merge that into a single workspace? So how do we bring AR or VR to enable that, to allow us to start feeling like we're in one environment? I think right now we don't get that sense 100% yet. The other one that I think is probably very pressing is around, and we haven't really had this raise its head yet, but there's that saying that on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. And I get a sense that, with things like deep fakes, when you're not in the presence of someone, you don't know who's sitting opposite, It's quite easy to replace faces now. It's quite easy to replace voices, and we're getting a lot better at that kind of stuff. And so we're having meetings with people that you can't be 100% sure that that's the person sitting opposite you anymore. And we haven't had cases of it yet, but I think we're going to have to start understanding, how do we authenticate and authorize individuals? How do we know who's who in this distributed environment, who we're engaging with? I think the third one is the sort of, already a sense I get of it is the sort of many-to-many interactions is not well understood yet. Like, how do you talk to a crowd of people? How do you talk to a boardroom, say, for instance? How do you get that feedback? I think, exploiting our peripheral senses, peripheral vision, stuff like that is not well understood. Maybe it goes back a little bit to AR, VR. I see things like maybe blockchain helping with individual authentication, authorization, those type of things, but not sure what the solutions are there. And then finally, I think, really understanding how do we optimize businesses using AI, bring this sort of machine learning into the business space, this distributed organization, distributed smart spaces that will allow artificial intelligence to make that a more fluid environment to work in, so that people get a better sense. And then one that I think is quite interesting, and I've seen a few, it's quite funny. You see like there's an invasion in people's home privacy. And you could have someone walk behind you. Your family's at home right now. Anything could happen in the background. And I really think that there needs to, technology needs to come to the fore and allow us to separate those things somehow, so that I can still be in my office here, but not be scared that some conversation or something in the background is suddenly available to everybody in the meeting, and YouTube and whoever else wants to see, sort of automating that privacy protection, automating the ways of separating these out, even though we're inside our home. So I think there's a lot of big research opportunities, a lot of new sort of challenges that have raised their heads, and I think a lot of opportunities here for innovation, technology, and people to sort of stand up and make businesses of this, entrepreneurs, researchers. I think new things have made themselves about challenges are available to us now.
It's interesting you say that, Terence, and I think that all of these fields then of research that you sketched out for us, and actually these are questions that come up online as well from the audience again and again, and I think this is what we battle with, particularly this idea of issues around security, but also privacy. And as you say, I've now, by virtue of what's happened, we have automatically invited people into our lives. We all know what's on the bookshelf behind everyone in our offices, at least, hey? And some of you online now as well. But what would your take on it be? And I want to come back to some of the ideas around the VR and AR techniques that you talked about as well. But maybe let's stay with the security and the privacy issue. Akram, any comments to that?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely vital, especially now that so much of, we were concerned just with mobile phone technology, right? And putting away private data out there. Now, exactly like Terence says, all of this is coming into our homes. But if you look at the broader context, because we are forced into the situation and we are tending to embrace technology so much more, the next phase is going to be IoT. And it's happening rapidly. You got wearables, you got smart speakers in your home, and voice assistants, and all of these things that are coming in. And of course, when you're looking now, especially under pandemic times, people are working out more in their personal space. The gyms are shut down. You've got a wearable on your wrist that's recording your heart rate and everything else. So all of this big data is being accumulated on individuals. So it's imperative then that organizations such as ourselves take precautions and implement processes to protect that data. And then, of course, in terms of governments, to have regulations to protect consumers and the general public with regards to that. But there's so much more for us to learn as we move on. And I think for me, speaking from Huawei, it's one of the benefits, being a leader in that space, whether it's wearables or mobile phones. We have those learnings and we've taken certain precautions. But of course, you got to also adapt your technology to the regulations. If you're comparing GDPR to POPI, for example, and make sure you comply on both sides, from a privacy perspective. So we have a responsibility, government have a responsibility, and then also the end user. The audience that's listening to us tonight also have a responsibility then to how they share their data and how they share their private information. One thing is, if you don't want somebody to come into your home space like this on a Zoom call watching what's going on, but you then post that onto Instagram or Facebook or Twitter later, it doesn't really make sense, right? So these are some of the steps we need to be able to take. But I think as we go along, it's right now it's brand new. As it's evolving, we're going to see more and more and more challenges coming up, and we're going to have to find those solutions as well. It's just happening so rapidly. I think it's mind-boggling for most people.
No, it is absolutely, and I think that staying with the idea of security, privacy. Peter, you work with businesses, and future-proofing businesses, and thinking through the future world of work, and this idea then of, can we be sure that we are actually talking, that it's me conducting this kind of panel discussion right now? How does that affect businesses as well, if you can't be sure with whom you're actually interacting and conducting your business with?
Well, as Terence correctly said, there's going to be a lot of work that needs to be done around deepfakes, for example, to make sure that we can detect, whether something is authentically true or not. But I just want to make a comment with regards to data and privacy and all that kind of thing. We have actually seen governments beginning to take a look at this issue. So as we know, in Europe, the privacy issues around data are definitely on the table. And to give you an example, a few months ago, and this became sort of something on the internet that many people laughed about. We remember when Mark Zuckerberg from Facebook appeared in front of the Senate hearing, and some of the senators were asking questions that you could clearly see they didn't have a comprehension as to where things have actually got to. But let me tell you, that is changing really fast, because they had a hearing now about a couple of days ago where they had, the guys from Amazon and Google and Facebook, and I can't remember who the other one was. But the point is, the questions had changed. The insights had changed. So these lawmakers had actually gotten a team of people together that understood the issues, and so now they could ask the right questions. So I do believe that that we are very quickly going to get to a place where there will be regulation as to what happens to your data, and there will be penalties for those that compromise that data. But I also think that we are going to get to a point very soon where your data will belong to you in a sort of blockchain kind of environment, and you will have the right to share it with whoever you want to. But it comes from you. It's your initiative. It's not something that's forced on you by an entity that you don't know, what's happening on the background. So I do think that we are heading into a space where these issues around privacy and what's allowed to be done with data and how much is to be collected, even in the South African context with this COVID situation, you remember the government actually said that they could use mobile data to see how people move around that have been registered as infected, etc. And there were regulations a lot around that. They have looked at how to make sure that that's not abused. So I think we're going to see more of that. And it is something that we as consumers should actually ask for too, in my opinion.
Mm. That's interesting. So there's, coming back to what we discussed earlier around then these areas that also, Terence, you sketched out around research and so on. So I guess that privacy is going to be a massive issue, and security and how data is used. And we've seen that, as you point out, Peter, through the Facebook scandal as well. And I think this is the first time it really hit home in the popular mind how big this issue actually is. Mm. I want to take the conversation, and we are slowly running out of time as well. The hour goes very, 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 very quick. But talking about staying with the COVID pandemic, technologies aside, the COVID pandemic is a human tragedy. And we've seen it, and we experience it more and more, and we see people falling prey to the virus, and an increase in fatalities in South Africa and around the world as well. And when we talk about technology, such as AI technology and VR, for example, can it really, and this is a question that's been asked online as well, can it really replicate the human experience? And Akram, you talked about the healthcare system and doctors working remotely and remote healthcare, for example. What would you say? Can it replicate the human experience? Or are we taking it maybe too far?
I don't think maybe replicating the human experience. We are social beings. We need that human interaction. I think it will augment it, most certainly, and improve the way we engage and optimize, make it more productive. This kind of engagement we're having now will never replace and does not replicate the office environment, but it certainly provides us a solution and an optimized way of still getting business done. I think where the concerns are coming in now from the general public, and this is across the board, not just with AR, VR, but even with 5G, and you've heard about the conspiracies, I'm sure, around that, is the fear of the unknown. And I'm coming out here on a limb. You guys, nobody brought up the question, and we are the world leader in 5G, so I'm taking a chance here talking about it. But the truth of the matter is, the fear of the unknown is what drives these kinds of concerns. And if you look throughout human history, the same thing has happened. We go all the way back to the times of Socrates and Aristotle, and these guys. They had an oral tradition, and we were moving over into written work thereafter. Writing came out. At that point, writing is considered technology. But people were afraid of handwriting because they felt that it will affect their memory. They would not be able to, because they had an oral tradition. When electricity first came about, there was resistance to putting out street lamps because people felt it'll keep them up at night and it'll affect their sleep. Today, we can't do without lights and electricity. We know the value of books and written work, and similar trends you see throughout human history. So certainly now we see the same kind of concerns with modern technology. And I think as we learn more, as we find, and I got to agree with like what Peter said as well, that perhaps the worst is behind us a little bit in terms of what could have gone wrong, whether it's from a privacy perspective, whether it's from an understanding. Now we are in the process of saying, well, how do we optimize and how do we use this technology to augment human interaction? And that's where we're going to see ourselves going forward.
No, thank you for that. And I think that, you know, these are really, really important aspects of it. And we often focus maybe too much on the technology, and we forget then that, you know, driving innovation are the humans behind the technology. And they need to be on board, and they need to have the capacity and be capacitated to do so. I'm going to ask for some sort of, you know, last minute comments maybe to wrap up tonight's discussion. Starting with you, Peter, what would you say going forward? So now we're talking about both the areas that needs more capacity building in terms of research, more resources. We also talked a little bit about what we need to do as humans, how we understand the technology and how it's being driven through the COVID pandemic now, and with all its tragedies as well. But what do you see the future holding? Is there such a thing as a post-COVID world? What will it look like, and how will we come out then out of this pandemic, and what will we see happening next?
So I do believe that there is a post-COVID world for sure. It will either come as a result of a vaccine or something like that. But I want to tell you that the changes that we are needing to make to the global economy, the changes that we are needing to make to our businesses, to the way we commute, and all those things, were going to have to happen anyway. And the reason I'm saying that is that there's another really, really big issue that is bearing down on us, which is the climate situation. So, you know, governments around the world, even coming out of this, are beginning to say, how can we come out of this in a way that we can now bear in mind that we have to do something about this very important issue, which is related to climate and decarbonizing our economies. And we've seen, as an example, with the remote work thing, for example, that we can take millions of cars off the road, for example. And I'm saying that the future will be where governments will actually make it illegal to drive a combustion engine, and therefore many organizations, while we wait for the transportation sector to be electrified, for example, will have to work this way indefinitely. So that's what I kind of see happening as we approach the next very big issue that we have to solve.
No, thank you for that, Peter. Terence, any sort of, what do you think how will we come out of the COVID epidemic? What will we have learned?
I really think that the one thing we would have learned is that we want to have contact with other humans. We would have learned the value of that. I think going into this, a lot of us thought that the world in which everybody works from home would be this perfect world. And I think people have got a sense now that maybe that's not ideal. Maybe we need some sort of a blend over here. But I do think there'll be a few other things. I think there will probably be a move away from like a time-based remuneration towards more of an output-based remuneration, as organizations start to realize that people working from home, you can't really govern their time anymore. I think workforces will become larger rather than smaller, because we see that there's probably a shift towards a 4-day work week or a 3-day work week, but a business still needs to run for 5, 6, maybe even 7 days. So maybe even larger workforces operating at different times globally. People don't have to be sitting in offices, so you don't have to think about physical space in terms of your workforce. You can actually start thinking about virtual space in terms of your workforce. So I definitely think we might actually see certain things happen that are unexpected in terms of how workforces and how these things change. And then finally, maybe just talking to education and universities and stuff. I don't think they'll be done away with at all. I think, you know, the human part of that is probably the most important thing you get out of a university, even more so than the calculus you might learn.
Yeah. No, thank you for that, Terence. And I'm going to leave the last word for you, Akram, quickly. Any thoughts on the post-COVID world?
Yeah, I certainly don't doubt that we're going to get out of this for the better. But I think it's helped us to reflect on how much we take for granted. Whether we look at relationships, whether we look at employment, business, we look at health and the priority we place on our own health. Everything has been just flipped on its head and given us a perspective, I guess. And if anything, COVID has now helped us to be able to plan better. We've had MERS, we've had SARS in the past, which were not as bad as this. So who knows what might be our next great challenge. The least we could take out of this is say, well, we've learned something and we can be able to be better prepared for the future.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. Peter, Akram, Terence, I couldn't wish for a more interesting panel. You've been absolutely fantastic, and so have you at home as an audience, as always. We haven't been able to channel all the questions, but we will do so. And for my wish for a post-COVID world, there are of course many, and first and foremost, I wish we get out of this and that we get out of it quickly and that we all stay healthy and well. And that's what I wish for you and for our audience at home as well. And then I wish to see you all on the 16th of September again, when we're going to talk about women and the role of women in 4IR, which is going to be a fascinating discussion as well. So God bless, stay safe, and have a really, really great evening, everyone. Thank you very, very much.
The University of Johannesburg, the future reimagined.